And hello, everybody, and welcome back this time to risk management. Hey, we'll start with this quote: never mistake an activity for an achievement. Pause and ponder that one. That's a good one. Okay, we are underway now and taking a look at risk and how it will apply to us. The risk content that we're discussing is relative to PMBOK 6, but what we're focused on is not the tools, techniques, inputs, and outputs, but we're focused on the concepts and the language, the vocabulary. Those are all exactly the same, and I think it gives you another picture of what the PMBOK 7 is really talking about. So I think it's kind of exciting. As you know, we've done this several times. This represents the 5 process groups of PMBOK 6. How we start a project called initiating, all the planning that goes on, executing a project, meaning building that deliverable, controlling that project, and closing the project. So these knowledge areas were used with a lot of processes in each. And integration is what you do. You're the project manager. You're the integration manager. So these yellow boxes still help you focus on what you do. Notice in planning, you're pulling all of these plans into you and you're reading them and you're working with the teams to make sure that they are balanced and support each other. Pretty exciting. Okay, we're not going to do the IPEC overview. These are the objectives for risk management. You can pause it and read it. Frankly, by the end, you should understand these terms, which are the same terms you'll find in PMBOK 6 and in 7. So frankly, the PMBOK has originally been broken up into 7 processes, right, in PMBOK 6. Always planning, and then you want to identify risks, which means you identify all risks in this process. Then you'll perform qualitative analysis. That's a subjective approach, a subjective risk analysis, but it's still valuable, and here's why. The goal of qualitative analysis is applied as you apply it to every single risk in your risk register. Reprioritizes the risks based on probability and impact. Things that are likely to happen and that can hurt you the most, probability and impact. That's qualitative. Then we'll do quantitative risk analysis, and that we call numeric. Now, I don't want to confuse the issue. I can use numbers in qualitative analysis. So I don't mean numbers. What I mean is I'm using studies and researched data, right, to do quantitative analysis. It's still based on probability impact, just like qualitative was, but instead of being subjective like an expert judgment, it is, which is good and good enough for prioritizing in process 3, it is quantitative. It's really based on numbers. And I'm only going to do this because this is hard to do. I'm only going to do this for the most challenging of the risks with the highest probability and impact. So I'm only going to do it on a few after I've organized them in step 3. Then I'm going to plan my risk responses, especially for those items that I did quantitative risk analysis on. Then we have to implement the response. This is a new process. And frankly, PMI has found that project managers are great at planning risk responses. What we're not good at is watching for the triggers and implementing those plans. And so the last process, which is normally a control process, it's still in that genre. We call it monitoring risks because we want to monitor for those triggers. Now, everything we've been doing up until now, all of these areas we've been discussing, scope, schedule, cost, etc., they are all about reducing risk on a predictive/waterfall project. When I say reduce risk, I mean threats. Risk is also an opportunity, and I want to increase the opportunities that I can create to make this project a success and reduce the threats. And all of those tie into our estimates as I try and balance the triple constraint: cost, schedule, and scope among resources. Okay, so with that, risk management, it's important just to define it up front, right? Risk by itself as a definition is just an uncertainty. It's either an opportunity or a threat. Unfortunately, we are conditioned by nature and by life to think of risk as threats. And they are, but risks are also opportunities. So a risk is an uncertainty that is a threat or an opportunity. We don't know if it'll happen. But risk management then is defined as planning risk is defined as the process of identifying and evaluating risks and planning for its responses. And notice that definition follows nicely with the process groups along the way. So you can see the very definition of risk management, which are these words up top, built into this concept of the processes in risk PMBOK version 6. The same concepts apply in PMBOK 7. And notice that when I plan risk responses and implement them, I'm looking for both opportunities and threats along the way. Whoops, went a little too far that time, didn't I? That's right. So let's go back. So this is just another way of thinking about risk. Remember I said a risk is an uncertainty. And think of it, as the project starts, I'm down here and I'm going to assess risks and plan against them. Notice that the project ends, of course, at this side of this 3D picture. Notice that a risk that executes early on costs less, but a risk that's discovered late or executes late will cost much more. That's the whole point to this slide. Agile would call risks a spike in the iteration, right? So that's something to consider. But frankly, Agile is change driven. If you find a risk, you hit a spike, you're going to work around it rapidly. That's the value of it, right? Where predictive or waterfall projects has been working towards controlling risks along the way. Okay, so that's what that slide was about. Now, we can't talk risks without understanding stakeholders. So each stakeholder, as well as the company culture itself, will have a risk appetite and a risk tolerance and a risk threshold. So the risk appetite is what day-to-day you're willing to accept. And whenever you consider these terms, consider it in light of the probability times the impact of a risk. So a risk appetite, this is a degree of uncertainty that you're willing to accept day to day. A risk threshold says, you know what, I'm not willing to accept that risk day to day, but for certain circumstances, if I've applied other mitigating controls, sure, I'll accept it. I had a boss that used to only allow one change per night in IT. That's all he was comfortable with. But on occasion, I was able to convince him to do 2 changes in a night, and I would justify it. You know, risk threshold is that limit above which this person or this culture will never exceed. It's the ceiling. And so you want to be able, as a project manager, consider stakeholder risk appetites, tolerance, and threshold in order to get your job done. Now, the processes breakdown. I'm not going to go through the inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs in great detail, but know that you want to have a risk management plan, right? A way to manage in a controlled environment this whole risk approach that you've decided to pursue. Part of that approach will be using a risk breakdown structure. We used the acronym RBS earlier in resource breakdown structure, so don't get those confused. But this time I'm talking risk and a risk breakdown structure. And in that RBS, I want to break risks into categories. Here's why. Risks are easier to manage when we group them into categories. If I'm building a house, I might have a category called water. It might include Water damage from rain might include water damage from pipes leaking. It might include water damage from a hurricane, right? But there are similarities, and I can leverage that to simplify my responses. That's really the key there to keep in mind. Now, after I plan risks, I want to identify all risks, right? And I want to plan against them. So that's really all I'm talking about. Again, I don't worry about the inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs as much. But when I identify all risks, there are ways to identify risks. I can use expert judgment, go talk to somebody that's done this a lot. I can do brainstorming. I can do data analysis. I can do prompt lists like PESTLE, VUCA, and TCOP, and I've spelled them out here. Pause the slide. I can even do a SWOT analysis. Notice SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Notice the last two of SWOT, the OT, is opportunities and threats. That's exactly what project management sees risk as, an opportunity or a threat. So that is always an exercise that is useful for identifying risks, right? And you want to look for other risks. You might include business risks. You might include insurable risk. What about risk variability, right? If there are changes and it's difficult to predict the future, that's about variability. Weather is a variable risk, right? If you're building a house. What about risk ambiguity, where there's imperfect knowledge due to a lack of understanding? You know, if you've ever deployed data loss prevention in a complex infrastructure, sometimes you'll have that risk ambiguity. That's also dangerous. And so we think of risks in terms of 1, individual risks, and 2, overall risk, right? So an individual risk here, there, maybe something we go, I can deal with. But what if several risks happen at the same time? How does that impact your sense of overall risk management, right? And then you want to have a plan to be resilient against the risks would be the key focus there. So when I identify risks, I do want to build a risk register. We've said before, a register is really just a silly name for a list. It's a list of risks, right? And in that list, I will include potential owners, potential responses, maybe the category I can bucket it in, etc. Those are just some good ideas. Nothing has to be in stone yet. These are just potential comments in my early risk register, okay? Now, once I've identified all my risks and put them in my risk register, then I'm going to move to qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. Remember I said qualitative was subjective probability and subjective impact. Even if you use numbers or letters, doesn't matter, and you could Google image qualitative risk analysis. But you're going to get a risk score, and that's going to rearrange all of these risks you've identified. It's going to rearrange them into a priority order that you should manage based on the probability and the impact, okay? Okay, here's a funny note. If you think it's hard to meet new people, hey, try picking up the wrong golf ball on the golf course. I think that's pretty funny. Okay, I am going to take a break there, and then we're going to come back and finish up in the short version with qualitative risk, quantitative risk, and planning and monitoring. Okay, thanks.